Hi, I'm Surbhi Kesar, and I'm going to today talk to you about gender and the informal sector employment in India. We're going to try and unpack these two kind of categories, one of informal economy and second of gender in the workforce in terms of how it exists in the Indian economy. So let's begin with informal economy. When we think about informal economy, usually very precarious forms of employment comes to our understanding. It could be people who work as domestic workers in the household. It could be construction wage workers. It could be vegetable sellers, selling vegetables on the sidewalks. Or it could be, let's say, a group of people getting together and making pots and selling it on the sidewalk. And majorly, people think of it as economy, which as work that is not really protected by any kind of labor laws. There's no stipulated social security associated with that kind of work. But let's try to unpack it in terms of these categories. And we can think of informal economy as comprising of A, the informal sector, and B, the informal employment. What is the informal sector? Informal sector can be thought of as enterprises or firms that do not employ, or rather they have an upper limit of employing 10 total workers. So all the enterprises which employ less than 10 total workers will be called the informal sector enterprises. But one thing to note is that even though you have this limit of 10 total workers, but most of the informal sector enterprises are extremely small, low productive enterprises that do not employ any wage worker. So most of the production or the enterprises, they operate just on the basis of getting together family and other household workers to work in some sort of a production activity. You can think of in terms of, let's say, quilt making or embroidery on a shawl, etc., where there's no wage worker being hired, and much of the enterprise activity consists of let's say the person's husband, wife, or partner, and children getting together and undertaking that kind of production. So that's in terms of the informal sector when we are in the domain of the enterprise, the people who are owning some kind of firm or enterprise, even if very small. The other is in terms of informal employment, which is when you yourself or the person themselves is wage employed. However, there's no long-term social security benefit or a long-term contract associated with it. Think of this in terms of the casual wage workers, and usually they will be hired on a daily wage rate, etc., and do not have that sort of a long-term contractual security of being part of the job, and most of the times are actually paid quite less, right? So it could be any of those two aspects, from the firm dimension or from the wage workers dimension, that could constitute what we call the informal economy. Now, when we talk about informal sector enterprises, out of all the enterprises in the Indian economy, 95% are actually informal sector enterprises. And as I said, most of them will be enterprises that do not employ any kind of a wage worker and usually undertake production using family labor. In terms of the total wage employment in the country, about 84%, as of the 2018 figures, were informally employed. What do these mean? These could comprise, as I said earlier, of workers working on casual wage paid on a daily basis, or even if there's some regular earning on a monthly basis, that is not really, you do not really have long-term contracts or social security benefits like your provident funds, etc., associated with it. So that's what we can think of in terms of informal economy, and the extent or the scale of what is the informal economy in India. And majority of the employment that we think about in the Indian economy is actually informal in nature. So then, we need to kind of understand, how did this informal economy come into being, right? We have to understand the genesis of this issue itself. And the idea in much of the development literature following, the work of Nobel laureate Arthur Lewis has been that, traditionally the underdeveloped economies were seen as comprising of this huge traditional agricultural sector and a much smaller modern industrial sort of a sector. And the idea was that with there being economic growth, people will be pulled out of this traditional agricultural sector and will find employment of a formal, secure kind, which is, higher paid, etc., in this formal modern segment. And that has kind of been the expectation in much of the development literature following Lewis. Whereas in Indian economy, as well as in various other economies, what kind of happened was, while growth took off, it increased the productivity, it increased the growth in the manufacturing, industrial services sector, but it did not really create the commensurate amount of secure formal jobs. So you have people that are being drawn out of agricultural sector. However, they are not really being absorbed in these modern formal sector jobs. And these kind of people that are drawn out of agricultural sector and are not able to find employment in formal, modern, secure kind of employments tend to be able to economically reproduce their livelihoods in this kind of informal economy. Either they would become the vegetable sellers that we were talking about, which let's say would be like a small enterprise, or they would become like casual wage workers, or they would have jobs like, let's say, security guards, etc., which is taken off in India quite a bit, is in terms of, however, not having any long-term social security benefits, which kind of questions the idea of what kind of development do we want, and how do we bring about a development that works for the majority, that works for the workers of the country. Now, that was in terms of what the informal economy looks like. Now, let's turn our gaze a little towards this idea of gender in the workforce, and we'll be focusing on male labor force participation and female labor force participation. And in India, the kind of male labor force participation, which is telling us the number of people who are kind of working or looking for work in Indian context, it's quite comparable to what exists in other parts of the world, and not just other parts of the world, but also in terms of developing countries, be it Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Brazil, etc. And it's pretty much between, somewhere around 75%, etc., and which is quite comparable. But the moment we look towards female labor force participation in the country, we see that the proportion of female rather, in the country, who are employed or are actively looking for work is much lower as compared to other countries of the world and other developing countries of the world, particularly Brazil, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, South Africa. So whether you look at it in a SAARC or a South Asian context or a BRICS context, India has very low female labor force participation. And much of the female labor force participation in India has been in agriculture. So this fall in female labor force participation that we see is actually a withdrawal of labor, women workers in agriculture as well. Now, when we simply look at within the informal economy, what the gender distribution looks like, again, what we find is that there are many more men in the informal economy than women that are in the informal economy in India. Even if we look at different sectors of the economy, agriculture, manufacturing, construction, services, of course, for all of these, we see that for women, the share in any of these sectors is relatively, so this would mean, let's say if we're looking at 2004 figures, which is what this graph with this dark blue kind of bar is telling us, the 35% of agricultural workforce is women, 34.9%, right? Which means the remaining 65%, which is the majority, is men. And in agriculture, it is still close to each other. But if we look at sectors like manufacturing, construction, services, the gap between the proportion of men and women is much higher. What these bars are simply telling us is the proportion of women in that sector, and anything that's left vis-a-vis 100 would be the proportion of men employed in that sector. And particularly agriculture and manufacturing had, somewhat for agriculture, 35% of employment. It was women who were employed in manufacturing sector, about 26.4%, and over between 2004 and 2015, roughly a decade, we do see a fall in women's share in this sector that has happened. So what we're talking about is a huge informal economy in the country. So majority of employment in the country or livelihoods in the country coming from this sort of informal, precarious, low productive work. And we're also seeing that majority share of in terms of who is employed, it's mainly men rather than women. And for women, there seems to be some sort of a fall from these sectors happening in India. As we just spoke about, the female labor force participation has been quite low, has been falling. It has now kind of is not falling anymore, but it is indeed quite low. Now, when we look at the gender dimension of the Indian workforce, we see the Indian workforce as being highly occupationally segregated. So we've talked about a huge informal economy. We've talked about a low female labor force participation. And then kind of as we're trying to think more about gender, we also see that the labor force is highly segmented on the basis of different occupations, right? And what that means is that certain kind of jobs tend to be more tend to have more concentration of men rather than women. So let's say when you have work like domestic work that happens in the household, care work that happens even in like in any of the spaces, that tends to be much more, many more women tend to be concentrated there than men. And there's also a high earning differential between men and women that exists. So now let's pause for a moment to kind of think about what are the various ways in which gender inequality can exist in the labor market, and more specifically in the informal economy. Why would we expect it to probably in certain instances be worse in the informal economy? First of all, just the very fact that in an informal economy, you do not have, strong governance mechanisms, let's say casual wage workers working on daily wage rate, etc. If it's not governed, there can be much more discrimination that the employer can carry out, right? And then there are other kinds of issues, and which is one of the ways through which women might be paid lower wages than men in construction wage work. Or it could simply be that, you think of women being in occupations that are relatively low skilled. And one may think about, the domestic care worker that comes to the household is being paid quite less. But one doesn't know whether that low payment is happening simply for the fact that this is low skilled work, or rather there has been interesting work by people like Nancy Folbre and others who talk about that these sectors also get paid lower or be denoted as lower skilled work simply because women tend to be working more in it. Then on the other hand, if you're an enterprise owner, the availability of credit might be limited to you, because that's another form in which discrimination might be meted out against women. The access to market and networks, again, could be quite limited to women, and we'll talk about this in just a while. In informal economy, mechanisms to dissuade occupational segregation are also limited. For example, in government jobs, you can have, better support or better affirmative action towards women. For example, have reservations of different kinds, or have, women having more number of years for which they can basically apply for an examination to sit for the government services. The same kind of mechanisms don't exist in the informal sector, which makes it kind of more discriminatory in instances on the basis of gender. When we now bring the two concepts together, gender in the workforce and informal economy, what we see is, again, there tends to be women are much more likely to be concentrated in as contributing family workers. What are these workers? Remember, we spoke about the informal sector enterprises, and we said that most of these enterprises undertake work only with the help of other family members and household workers, and don't really employ wage workers. when these household members are classified as contributing family workers because they're not really getting a wage in return for it, an explicit wage payment that's happening. Usually the entire earning will be divided within the household as as the entire household earnings. And more often than not, it'll be men who will basically take ownership of the earnings. So it's mainly these contributing family workers, which in many cases don't have ownership over the earnings that come inside the household, that contribute, that where women tend to be, quite concentrated. Whereas for men, there's actually men are more likely to be in casual wage work than women. So that's kind of where we are seeing within informal economy where the concentration of men and women tend to happen. If we look at specific work categories within the informal economy, what you can see here is in the graph, let's say for each of the bars, the colors represent different kind of informal work, which is given at the bottom axis. You could be a domestic worker, you could be a home-based worker, street vendor, construction worker, waste worker, or other informal worker. And what you kind of see is within female, there's a huge proportion who is home-based worker, and a huge proportion that's actually domestic worker. So it's like there are various reasons why something like this could happen. One, domestic work, it's seen to be often women's domain, etc., and therefore a lot of women tend to be doing that. Which, of course, I'm not saying that that's how it should be. That has how historically it has been, with women being relegated to spaces of care, household activities, etc. And also one of the reasons, as I mentioned earlier, these activities will be paid lesser, not simply because, they might be low skilled or anything, because women tend to do it and there is a discriminatory wage that's paid to women. Whereas, and they'll also tend to do a lot more home-based activities, etc. Whereas when you talk about construction labor, that's where men tend to be concentrated, which is also a quite precarious kind of job that exists. Now, if we look at simply the earnings gap between female and male, this is also very interesting. Regular wage work is all kind of work where the payments are received on a monthly basis. Now, this has a huge variation. This could be a formal sector employment, the secure kind of government services, right? But these could also be domestic workers. Let's say the person who comes to clean, the worker who comes to clean the household, etc., is also paid on a monthly basis. But they're relatively better off than the casual wage workers. Casual wage workers being people who are paid on a daily basis, usually the construction workers. And self-employed, it's another term that when we were talking about informal employment. So these are workers who are self-employed as, the owner of the firm. And we gave examples of, let's say, an embroidery, a person who's doing embroidery on a shawl, etc., with family, etc. So you could be self-employed, where you're not really like a big employer, etc., but you tend to be this enterprise owner in the small enterprise. And here, if we look at the earning differential between men and women, it's huge. What you're saying is that in regular wage work, women get 76% of what men earn. That is, if a man is getting 100 rupees, a woman is getting 76 rupees. And as you go towards these informal employment, the difference actually increases. For casual wage workers, 60% less than what a man gets is what a woman is getting. For self-employed, interestingly, which is another form of informal employment, as we spoke about, remember, like informal economy we were talking about in terms of informal employment, which is the informal wage work, which was all of casual wage work and some part of regular wage work. And then within informal enterprises, we were talking about these self-employed household based, family-based enterprises. And there you see the women-owned enterprises are only getting 43% earnings of what men tend to get. So there are these different levels at which this kind of differential between men and women is operating in the labor market, starting from how many women enter into the workforce, where is it that they enter, what kind of work they do, and even if they do same kind of work, how much lower do they earn? So that's the three kind of levels that we need to keep in mind. One about the kind of whether women have the opportunities to access the labor market itself or not. They could be constrained by various reasons. One, in terms of whether people are hiring them or not, whether an employer wants to hire them or not. Second, in terms of norms, social norms that exist in the country, because of which they might not be. Then, even if they are hired, what kind of works they're hired into? Are they majorly being hired into works that tend to be low paid, that tend to be low remunerative, etc., versus occupationally more kind of better paid jobs, etc. And finally, even if they're doing same kind of work, they tend to be paid lower. So we have various nodes at which policy interventions can happen. A, to provide better opportunities to women, etc. B, what kind of jobs women, what kind of occupations where women are not historically there, but are good paying jobs where women can be given more opportunities to enter. And even if they have same kind of job, what sort of earnings, how to ensure that they do not earn lesser than men. And not just that, remember, now self-employed, it's very interesting, and we'll talk about it in a while, why even when you're an enterprise owner, a woman might be earning less than a man. Now, if we'll now focus on what, majority of what is this self-employed or the informal sector enterprises. Now, broadly, the informal sector enterprises, as I had said earlier, can be classified into those enterprises that do not employ any wage worker, usually use family-based work, family members in order to undertake production. So these are called the own account workers, whereas so the way this graph kind of classifies is an own account worker is a single worker firm, that is, you're undertaking production, let's say embroidering a shawl, but only single individual. The light kind of turquoise bar that you have here is the family-based enterprise, that is, you are undertaking production, not just you, but let's say I get my child or my sister to work with me or my brother to work with me. That's a family enterprise. And then these are establishments, which, as I said, have this upper limit of 10 total workers, but they can hire a wage worker. So these will be enterprises that do employ worker, but are still quite, on the lower end of the spectrum of earnings. And here, if we kind of compare the earning differentials as well, we find that particularly for these single worker firms or family-based firms, there's actually quite a huge differential, particularly for the single owner firm, which again is the majority of what informal sector is. And what you find here is women tend to earn 34% of what men earn. In 2010, this difference was 38%. In 2015, the difference was the difference wasn't 38%, but women tend to earn 38% of what men earn. So if men are getting 1,000 rupees in let's say a week or something, women tend to get 380 rupees. And the difference hasn't really changed over this entire decade that we see here. The gap is kind of narrower when you're at relatively better kind of informal sector enterprises. But again, that gap is, it's kind of rising over this particular time frame that we were seeing. That is, for 2005, women were earning 84% of what men were earning in establishments or in firms, informal firms that do hire wage workers. And by 2015, they're only earning 73% of what men were earning. So what can explain these kind of differences? And here we can think about reasons such as occupational segregation, which could be women are just in enterprises or producing those kind of things that are not valued a lot by the market. So it'll be better for them to move into certain sectors which are better paid, or in certain kind of producing goods that are better paid. It could be the location of the enterprise, and this is something that I find even in my work, that women are likely to be located in enterprises that are located within the household, and this could be a part of various social norms of women not being allowed to work outside the household. So you could do embroidery on the shawl till the time you're inside the household, which limits a lot of, their outward facing engagement with the market and selling the products, etc., for which one can think of setting up, cooperative sort of setups where women can get together and produce their products, etc., and can be marketed and be provided better marketing facilities, etc. It could be because of differential asset availabilities. Women enterprises tend to have lower assets than male-owned enterprises. Credit availability can be one of the reasons. And of course, in these cases, there can be government interventions in terms of providing better credit for women to start up their enterprises, etc. And with that, we're going to talk a bit about, the subcontracting linkages that exist in the informal sector enterprises in the country. A lot of these informal sector enterprises tend to enter into these contractual linkages, which is they link to a bigger firm, such that they get the order from the bigger firm or the contractor to produce something, and then they sell it back to them. And usually it's been understood in the literature that this is going to be like a good way to help these smaller firms grow. However, what we see in the Indian case is that actually subcontracting linkages are usually happen with really low and low productive firms. And women-based firms are more likely to enter into these kind of subcontracting linkages, which could be because this allows them a secured market access. They can sell their product to someone, especially at a time when the credit availability is lesser to them, asset availability is less to them, and market access is less for them. So in that case, there's a contractor or a firm which directly gives them the raw materials to produce something, gives them the design by which they can produce, and purchases the final product from them. However, the catch in the story is that most of these subcontracting linkages, as they've existed in the Indian informal sector, and particularly this table that you have here is for the manufacturing sector, where the percentage of female-headed these own account enterprises in the manufacturing sector is much higher for in women in subcontracted enterprises than in the non-subcontracted ones. That is what we're talking about here is that 21% of non-subcontracted enterprises tend to be headed by women, whereas only 48%, whereas on the other hand, 48% of subcontracted enterprises tend to be headed by women. So there is much more concentration of women in subcontracting linkages. However, in India, much of the subcontracted is this traditional putting out systems where you get the raw materials design specified by the contractor and you buy the entire purchase from them. However, there's no transfer of technology that happens. And as I said, most of the times they're extremely low productive firms. So one has to think about if one is thinking about establishing subcontracting linkages with these smaller firms, especially women-owned, in order to provide them this assured market access, etc. One has to think about also using that to develop their entrepreneurial capabilities in developing their market access through other channels and giving them more autonomy so that it doesn't just become like a dependent sort of linkage on these larger firms, which can be mostly extractive in nature, and where these firms or where these subcontracted firms, especially women-owned, get really low revenues and earnings out of it. And it's also important to think a little bit about the recent pandemic, because it was one of the big, apart from other, also a livelihood disaster. And what we saw is that women were much more likely to lose employment during the lockdown than men did. However, even upon recovery, the informal self-employment was sort of a fallback option for men that did exist. Whereas for women, much of the movement was into outer workforce. What you see here on the graph is the left-hand side denotes what, both for men and women. The upper panel is for men, the lower for women. That is the proportion of the entire workforce that was in these different sectors, and these kind of movements denote where is it that men or women, depending on which panel we're looking at, went to. And we do see like there was a huge movement from different parts of the workforce into self-employment after the lockdown. Whereas for women, there's actually a huge movement that's happened out of the workforce. So women tend to be in this precarious employment, but in certain occupations, it's where there is, a higher women concentration. But even in informal employment, they're paid much less. And when a disaster kind of a thing or like an economic crisis strikes, what tends to happen is even these spaces are taken over by men, and women are pushed out of the workforce. So then there comes a question of, okay, we've spoken about informal employment. We've spoken about different ways in which the gender inequality in the labor force, and particularly in informal employment, manifests. So are we then talking about that, okay, women need to find more employment, and particularly in the informal economy? And the answer there would be overall, no, informal employment is not a choice that anyone should have had to make. Why? Because it's precariously low earnings, it's lack of decent work conditions. Look at the construction workers, and you'd often hear from field works, this stories of so many construction workers having lost some limb working there or being hurt. Or if you've gone to a construction site, a lot of women have had to carry on care work of feeding their children, etc., also on those sites. So it's not a preferred kind of employment where you would want either men or women to be working. There has to be construction, but it can be provided in much more secure ways. There needs to be, informal economy don't have social security. So that itself is a problem for be it men or women. And there's a very worrying trend in India, which is this move towards higher informalization of even the formal sector jobs that has been underway for quite some time now. So we need to focus on more formal kind of employment, more kind of more social security benefits, more longer term contracts for both men and women. However, in terms of for women particularly, they may opt in to be in informal employment because a lot of times there's not enough jobs available, the formal sector jobs around where they live, and they end up taking these jobs where there's flexible working hours, where commute might be lesser, or which allows women to perform care work, etc. However, the point is to provide these flexibilities for women even in the formal sector job, rather than saying that, look, because informal sector allows it, this is something that should be allowed. And there's a lot that can be done here, right? It majorly the kind of policy processes and the policy making that we have, they tend to be gender blind. And what does gender blind mean? That if in a society we already face these gender-based hierarchies, if you have a policy that is not going to actively take into account these gender-based inequality, it will tend to reproduce a lot of these gender-based hierarchies, and which is something we did see happening in the pandemic or other economic crises as well. What we need to focus on, of course, is both the demand side and the supply side issue. The demand side is just generating better formal sector employment. They're needing more investment in sectors that have higher employment elasticity, that employ more labor. And those are the kind of jobs that need to be there. And what we are seeing is even formal sector jobs, they're increasingly works that's been contracted out at extremely precarious sort of employments, which is not something that we can go for if we want better jobs and better employment opportunities. There needs to be better wages for those at the lower end of the income spectrum. And this can also have a high and positive impact on growth, because when people at the lower end of the income distribution, they in fact spend much of their income, especially on consumer durables, which can have a higher multiplier effect for the economy. So so people at the higher end of the income spectrum will tend to save more, whereas those at the lower end of the spectrum, given that the income is low, will tend to spend more, which can boost the economy. There needs to be a strengthening of labor laws, which allows for people to seek redressal in cases where they might not be protected in their work. There needs to be binding floor wages, that is lower level of wages beyond which the wages can't fall. And that we need to have, because we're increasingly moving towards this race to the bottom of how low one producer can produce at, which puts the workers and those who are informally employed at high risk. And we generally need more skilled jobs to exist, especially with the advent of AI, etc. We need more kind of jobs that where human employment does contribute positively. And of course, there needs to be gender sensitive public expenditure. There are a lot of sectors like public health, education, and care services where women are better represented, right? So we already spoke about occupational segregation. So that kind of occupational segregation, one can also use to the advantage of policy, where one can think about, okay, these are the sectors in which we need to kind of invest more, because that's where women tend to be more represented, and these are better paying jobs. So especially when we talk about, let's say, Anganwadi workers, etc., and women working in as a lot of there are a lot of these volunteer kind of work which exists even in public sector. But the problem is, a lot of times these women are just given the status of a volunteer, not really a worker. So they're not protected by a lot of these contractual obligations. They're not protected by they don't have a social security. So what we're talking about is in terms of having women be in these spaces, but also under more secure job contracts and being given their rights as workers. From supply side, there are various things that can be done. While skilling is important, it's not the only aspect of it. However, skilling can help, and it needs to be supplemented with better marketing facilities, like developing community hearts where women artisans especially, can be better represented, and it's done in a fair manner. There needs to be things like more support in terms of transportation, safety, and childcare support. And a lot of time when there's, with the process of urbanization underway, there is much less care services, or rather communal care activities that are available in urban areas. There's work by Leela Gautam, which shows that. And in that case, it's in order to facilitate women's employment and in order to allow for them to go out for work, there needs to be better safety services. There needs to be better childcare support, which allows them to do it, because still most of the burden within the household does fall on women. And I already spoke about it, but there needs to be much more investment in sectors to provide not just jobs, but also more security and better paid wages to women, so that there can be both a demand and supply side issue that can be tackled concomitantly. And we spoke about various policy options throughout the session in terms of different nodes at which this can be applied, and what kind of activities need to be, what kind of policies can help with that. But one thing we need to remember and remind ourselves is the question isn't just about getting more women into the workforce, right? Because if it is under precarious sort of job contracts, etc., rather one needs to think about secure, formal, and better paying jobs by which women can be included in the economic process, and so that the development that we're thinking about can be made more gender egalitarian. Thank you.
In India, more than 90% of the total female workforce operates in the informal sector. According to different estimates, India has one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world. It fell to 15.5% once the pandemic hit, subsequently affecting jobs. The situation is slowly improving. Kerala has one of the lowest female LPR, whereas Tamil Nadu has one of the highest, much above the national average. Women do arduous work as wage earners, piece rate workers, and casual laborers, and are often engaged in unpaid family labor. In the unorganized sector, women's work is invisible, unrecognized, and often unremunerated. By and large, the working conditions are poor, and they don't have any control over the same. Struggle for a facility to urinate and struggle to sit, organized by Women's Collective Penkuta, were the first of their kind in the history of Kerala. Consequently, many textile workers rose in protest against their employers in different parts of the state.
അപ്പോൾ ഈ ജോലീൻ്റെ ഒരു സ്വഭാവം അതെന്നത് കസാരയില്ല. അപ്പോൾ ഞങ്ങൾ നിങ്ങൾ അപ്പോൾ തീരെ ഇരിക്കൂലേ എന്ന് വെച്ചപ്പോൾ തൊഴിലാളികൾ പറഞ്ഞ് ഞങ്ങൾക്കൊന്ന് വല്ലാണ്ട് പ്രശ്നമാകുമ്പോൾ ഞങ്ങൾ ടോയ്ലറ്റിൽ പോവും, യൂറോപ്യൻ ക്ലോസറ്റിൻ്റെ മേലെ ഒന്നിരിക്കും. പക്ഷെ അവിടെയും ഞങ്ങൾക്ക് അങ്ങനെ കുറേ നേരം ഇരിക്കാനൊന്നും പറ്റില്ല. പഞ്ച് ചെയ്തിട്ട് വേണം ഞങ്ങൾ ടോയ്ലറ്റിൽ പോവാൻ. 5 മിനിറ്റിൽ കൂടുതലായാൽ ആ 5 മിനിറ്റെല്ലാം കൂട്ടി രാവിലെ വരുന്ന 5 മിനിറ്റ് അഥവാ നേരം വൈകിയാൽ അതെല്ലാം കൂട്ടി അത് 1 മണിക്കൂറാക്കും, അര ദിവസമാക്കും, പിന്നീട് 1 ദിവസമാക്കിയിട്ട് ശമ്പളം വെട്ടിക്കുറയ്ക്കാനാണ് ചെയ്യുക. അതിൽ മിക്ക തൊഴിലാളികളും രോഗികളായിരുന്നു. വെരിക്കോസ് പോലെ, നട്ടല് തേയ്മാനം, വെള്ളമൊന്നും മര്യാദയ്ക്ക് കുടിക്കാൻ പറ്റായിട്ട്, ടോയ്ലറ്റ് പോകാൻ കഴിയായിട്ടൊക്കെ, ഈ യൂട്രസ് കംപ്ലൈൻറ്റ്, മിക്ക സ്ത്രീകളും രോഗികളായിരുന്നു. അപ്പോൾ ഈ മേഖലയിൽ ഇരിക്കാൻ സമ്മതിക്കുന്നില്ലേ എന്നത് ഞങ്ങളൊരു പഠനം നടത്തി. നോക്കുമ്പോൾ എല്ലാ സ്ഥാപനത്തിലും CC ക്യാമറ വെച്ചിട്ട് തൊഴിലാളികളെ നിരീക്ഷിക്കുക. അവരിയ്ക്കുന്നുണ്ടോ, അവർ മൂത്രമൊഴിക്കാൻ പോകുന്നുണ്ടോ, അവർ ഭക്ഷണം കഴിക്കുമ്പോൾ ഒരുപാട് സമയം എടുക്കുന്നുണ്ടോ, 20 മിനിറ്റ് ഒക്കെ എടുക്കുന്നുണ്ടോ, അവർ ജോലി ചെയ്യുന്നത് എങ്ങനെ, അവരുടെ പെർഫോമൻസ് എങ്ങനെ.
In 2018, the Left Democratic Front-led Kerala government brought in an amendment to the Shops and Commercial Establishments Act. Following the path led by the Kerala government, a right to sit bill was introduced in Tamil Nadu Legislative Assembly in September 2021.
2014 ഞങ്ങൾ സമരം ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ ഞങ്ങളോട് ചോദിച്ചത് എന്താണെന്നറിയോ, നിങ്ങൾക്ക് ഇരിക്കാനുള്ള നിയമമുണ്ടോയെന്നാണ്. അപ്പം ഞങ്ങൾ ചോദിച്ചാൽ അപ്പോൾ ഇരിക്കേണ്ടാനുള്ള നിയമമുണ്ടോ? അതില്ലല്ലോ. ഒരു തൊഴിലാളിക്ക് തൊഴിൽ ചെയ്യാനുള്ള എല്ലാ സാഹചര്യവും ഒരുക്കേണ്ടത് തൊഴിലുടമേൻ്റെ ഉത്തരവാദിത്തമാണ്. അത് ഇവിടുത്തെ ലേബർ ഓഫീസർമാരാണ് ഇൻസ്പെക്ഷൻ നടത്തി നടപ്പിൽ വരുത്തേണ്ടത്. നിയമമുണ്ടോ ചോദിച്ചാൽ ലേബർ ഓഫീസർമാർക്ക് നിയമം ഉണ്ടാക്കി കൊടുത്തു സർക്കാർ. തൊഴിലാളി സർക്കാർ ആയതുകൊണ്ടാണ് അവർക്കത് മനസ്സിലാക്കിയത് അങ്ങനെ ചെയ്തത്. പക്ഷെ അതിവിടെ നിയമം നടപ്പിലാക്കേണ്ടത്, തൊഴിലാളികൾക്ക് അനുഭവിക്കാൻ കഴിയണത് അത് ഇവിടുത്തെ ഉദ്യോഗസ്ഥന്മാരാണ്. ലേബർ ഓഫീസർമാരെ പിടിപ്പുകേടാണ്. ഞാൻ ഇന്നലെയും പോയിട്ടുണ്ട് ലേബർ ഓഫീസിൽ. ഒരു മാറ്റവും ലേബർ ഓഫീസർമാർക്കില്ല. അവരതിൻ്റെ മുതലാളിക്ക് രക്ഷപ്പെടാനുള്ള പഴുതുകൾ അന്വേഷിച്ചു കൊണ്ടിരിക്കുക. വീട്ടിൻ്റെ അകത്തെ പട്ടിണിയും കുട്ടികളെ വിദ്യാഭ്യാസമൊക്കെ കണ്ട് സഹിച്ച് എനിക്ക് എന്ത് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുന്നുള്ള രീതിയിൽ വീടിന് ഇറങ്ങുക. ആ ഇറക്കം മക്കളെ പട്ടിണി, മക്കളെ അസുഖം, വീടിൻ്റെ വാടക എല്ലാം ഈ സ്ത്രീ തൊഴിലാളികളാണ് കൊടുക്കുന്നത്. ആ വിഷമത്തിൻ്റെ ഭാഗമായിട്ട് അവർ സഹിക്കുകയാണ്. ഇനിയിപ്പോൾ നിങ്ങൾക്കൊരു പരാതി തന്ന് അത് ഭാഗത്തു കൂടെ ഒറ്റ കൊടുക്കുമ്പം അതും അവർ സഹിക്കണ്ടല്ലോ. ഒറ്റകിടത്ത കേസുകൾ ഞങ്ങളുടെ മുന്നിലുണ്ട്.
ഈ ഒരു ആക്ട് അമെൻമെൻറ്റ് വന്നതോടുകൂടി ലേബർ ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റിന് അക്കാര്യത്തിൽ പരാതി കിട്ടിയാൽ നടപടിയെടുക്കാനും അതോടൊപ്പം ഇൻസ്പെക്ഷൻസ് നടത്തി അത് ഉറപ്പുവരുത്താനും ഉള്ള ഒരു റൈറ്റ് കിട്ടിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. ലേബർ ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റ് ഫേസ് ചെയ്യുന്ന ഒരു ചലഞ്ച് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് പലപ്പോഴും സ്ത്രീകൾ പരാതി തരാറില്ല എന്നുള്ളതാണ്. നമ്മൾ ഇൻസ്പെക്ഷന് പോകുമ്പോൾ അവിടെ ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞല്ലോ, ഇൻസ്പെക്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ നമുക്ക് കാണാൻ പറ്റുന്ന ഒരു കാര്യം അവിടെ സീറ്റ് ഉണ്ടാവും. സീറ്റില്ല എന്ന് പലപ്പോഴും റിപ്പോർട്ടിൽ എഴുതാൻ പറ്റില്ല. പക്ഷെ അത് ഇരിക്കാനുള്ള ഒരു സാവകാശം അവർക്ക് കിട്ടുന്നുണ്ടോ ഇല്ലയോ എന്നുള്ള കാര്യത്തിൽ എവിഡൻസ് തരാനായിട്ട് പലപ്പോഴും എംപ്ലോയീസ് മടിക്കുന്നു എന്നുള്ളത് ഒരു ഫാക്ടറാണ്.
അസംഘടിത മേഖലാ തൊഴിലാളി യൂണിയൻ, the first women's trade union in Kerala, evolved from പെൺകൂട്ട്.
എനിക്ക് മൂത്രമൊഴിക്കാൻ പറ്റുന്നില്ലേ വിജയിച്ച്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നമ്മുടെ യൂണിയൻ ഓഫീസിൽ വന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ എനിക്ക് പീരീഡ്സ് കാലത്തൊക്കെ ഇങ്ങനെ വല്ലാത്ത ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുണ്ട്, എന്നൊക്കെ പറയുമ്പോൾ ഇതൊരു ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടായിട്ട് മനസ്സിലാവുന്നത് ഞാനും ഞങ്ങളുടെ സ്ഥാപനത്തിലെ പെണ്ണുങ്ങളും അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഞങ്ങളുടെ യൂണിയനിലെ പെണ്ണുങ്ങളധികം അവർ പെണ്ണായതുകൊണ്ടാണ് മനസ്സിലാവുന്നത്. മറ്റൊരു ഇപ്പോൾ ഞങ്ങൾ പോവുകയാണെങ്കിൽ ഒരു തൊഴിലാളി പോവുകയാണെങ്കിൽ ഒരു ഏത് ട്രേഡ് യൂണിയൻ എടുക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അവർ പുരുഷന്മാരേക്കും അവരോട് ഇത് പറയാനും അവർക്ക് മടിയായിരിക്കും. കാരണം പണ്ടൊക്കെ ഞങ്ങൾ മൂത്രപ്പുര സമരം നടത്തുമ്പം തന്നെ പെണ്ണുങ്ങൾ മൂത്രമൊഴിക്കുക എന്ന് ഉറക്കെ പറയാ. അങ്ങനെ അതിനെപ്പോലെ സെക്സിനോട് ഉപമിക്കാൻ ശ്രമിക്കുന്ന പുരുഷാധിപത്യ ലോകമാണ് ഇവിടെ.
Activists like Maithili Shivaraman, who worked for decades among women, especially from disadvantaged communities, were significant in paving the way for organizing the working class in Tamil Nadu. Now, as a decade has passed since the adoption of the Domestic Workers Convention by the ILO, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the continued vulnerabilities of domestic workers in the labour market. Many associate domestic workers with low status, as their work is often regarded with social stigma and subject to discrimination.
ചില ആൾക്കാർ ഭക്ഷണം കൊടുക്കില്ല. നമ്മളെ വീട്ടിലിപ്പോൾ ഒരാൾ ജോലിക്ക് വന്നു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഒരു ജോലിക്കാരി എന്നുള്ള രീതി അതിനേക്കാളും ചിലപ്പോൾ താഴെ ഉള്ള സംസാരമായിരിക്കും. അവർ അകറ്റി മാറ്റി നിർത്തുക, അവർക്ക് പിന്നെ തറയിലിരുത്തി ഭക്ഷണം കൊടുക്കുക, അവരടുത്ത് നല്ല രീതിയിൽ പെരുമാറില്ല, തൊടുന്നതിനും പിടിക്കുന്നതിനും വഴക്ക്, ഇങ്ങനെയൊക്കെയുള്ള അവർക്ക് പിന്നെ ഭക്ഷണം കഴിക്കാൻ വേറൊരു പാത്രം, വെള്ളം കുടിക്കാൻ വേറൊരു പാത്രം, ബാത്റൂമിൽ പോകണമെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അവർ വേറെ എവിടെയെങ്കിലും പൊക്കോണം, അവരെ വീട്ടിനകത്ത്, അങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ ഞാൻ കേട്ടിട്ടുണ്ട്, ഒരുപാട് കേട്ടിട്ടുണ്ട്.
In 1999, the union Pen Tholilalar Sangam was formed by Sujata Modi for the domestic workers amidst a reluctance from the mainstream trade unions in Tamil Nadu.
Raising wage is a very tricky issue because it's not in our hands. It's also very informal. Who do we raise the wage to? But when women started coming out on the street in hundreds, in every neighborhood around Chennai, I think it really inspired us, and we started going to the government with our demands. No one actually respects a domestic worker. And when you go to meet an officer on domestic workers' issues, if they call you back, it's 99% because they need a domestic help for their daughter who is going to have a delivery, or a grandmother or wife or the other. One of the things that women learned was that to deal with the police station, to seek a sort of dignity within the police station, to even ask for a chair. So domestic workers face a water crisis. They can never reach their workplace in time. Employers are not going to understand why they are not on time. So these kind of issues we started to organize locally on a number of issues. It could be ration shops, it could be drinking water, any kind of civic citizenship rights were also being taken up, as well as individual issues of violence or domestic issues or children's education.
PTS, with its systematic outreach, decentralized structure, rising local leadership and digitalized procedures, has now almost 25,000 members.
The idea that the women who work in houses are domestic workers, so is very important. The relationship between employee is changing in this domestic work sector. Similarly, the terminology is changing, and workers are also gaining a certain degree of dignity and recognition for their work, and able to negotiate and demand certain rights. So there is definitely a change that is possible, and should this change be not facilitated by the government by bringing law or by bringing some degree of formalization, because then this would be a harmonious change. I think change, self-perception is very important in the transformation of a person from being a servant to a worker, to knowing that they had no rights to knowing that they have rights. And that is where we as trade unions need to really focus on.
In the garment industries in Chennai, Chengalpattu, Kanchipuram, Tiruvallur and Vellore, it is estimated that there are around 2 lakh women workers. PF, gratuity and bonus were not provided to many among them. Several cases of workplace harassment were reported. Layoffs continued without much adherence to existing rules and laws. In a bid to not pay benefits to the workers, they are forced to resign after 4 years and then asked to rejoin so that their work experience is shortened.
3000 2000 சொல்லிட்டு வாங்கிட்டு இருந்த இடத்துல கிட்டத்தட்ட அவங்க வந்து 5000 ரூபாய்க்கான சம்பளம் உயர்த்தப்பட்டது. அந்த 2014 புது சம்பளத்துக்கான அரியர்ஸ் பணத்தை எல்லாருக்கும் கொடுக்கணும்னு ஆர்டர் போட்டாங்க. எல்லா கம்பெனிகளுமே அதற்கான ஆர்டர்ஸை போட்டு அரியர்ஸை கொடுத்தாங்க. ஆனால் இந்த கேஸ் நடத்தும்போது பார்த்திங்கன்னா கிட்டத்தட்ட 150 கம்பெனிகள் இந்த வழக்கை நடத்தக்கூடாதுன்னு சொல்லிட்டு ஸ்டே எல்லாம் வாங்கினாங்க. மற்ற யூனியன்கள்லாம் பார்த்திங்கன்னா ஆண்கள் தான் தலைவராக உட்கார்ந்துருப்பாங்க. ஆனால் இந்த யூனியனில் ஒரு பெண் தான் இருந்தாங்க. அந்த பெண் வந்து எடுத்த விடாமுயற்சி தான் வந்து இந்த பெரிய சக்ஸஸ்க்கு காரணமாக இருந்துச்சு. எந்த ஆண் யூனியன்களாலேயும் செய்ய முடியாத ஒரு விஷயத்தை வந்து ஒரு பெண் தலைமைத்துவத்தின் அடிப்படையில் இது பெரிய ஒரு சக்ஸஸாக ஆச்சு.
Garment and Fashion Workers Union, the only trade union in Tamil Nadu in this sector, working since 2005, has 5,000 members from 12 companies.
கம்பெனிக்குள்ளாரே டார்கெட்டுன்ற பேரில் அதாவது ஒரு 80 பீஸ் தான் அடிக்க முடியும் ஒரு மணி நேரத்துக்குன்னா 150 பீஸ் கொடுத்தா எப்படி அடிக்க முடியும்? அவங்க என்ன சொல்கிறாங்கன்னா 150 பீஸ் கொடுக்குறாங்க, ஆனால் டீ டைமுக்கு ஜஸ்ட் ½ அன் ஹவர் விடுறாங்க. டீ டைமுக்கு ஒரு 15 மினிட்ஸ் தான் விடுறாங்க. 15 மினிட்ஸ்க்குள்ளே டீ சாப்பிடணும். சில பேர் அதுக்காகவே டீ சாப்பிட்றதில்ல, ஏன்னா டார்கெட் கிடக்கல, அதை அடித்து முடிக்கணும் ஒரு மணி நேரத்துக்குள்ளே. அப்போ என்னன்னா அந்த டீயை கூட சாப்பிடணும். அதே மாதிரி ½ அன் ஹவர் லஞ்சுக்கு கொடுப்பாங்க. ½ அன் ஹவர் லஞ்சுக்கு கொடுக்கும் பொழுது அந்த ½ அன் ஹவர் லஞ்சு கூட அவங்க எடுக்க மாட்டாங்க. ஏன்னா அதுக்குள்ளார ஃபீஸ் அடிச்சு ஆகணும்னு சொல்லிட்டு அது 4 வாயை கப்புன்னு போட்டுட்டு ஒரு நிம்மதியாக கூட சாப்பிட முடியாது. சாப்பிட்டு அப்படி சில நேரங்களில் சாப்பிடாமே விட்டுருவாங்க, லஞ்சே சாப்பிட மாட்டாங்க, இதை அடித்து முடிக்கணுமே அப்படின்னு சொல்லிட்டு. இது மாதிரி நிறைய சேக்ரிஃபைஸ் பண்ணி தான் அந்த டார்கெட் அவங்க வந்து ரீச் பண்ணுறேன். பாத்ரூம் போனால் கூட ஒரு 10 நிமிஷம் லேட் ஆகிட்டு கூட, என்ன 10 நிமிஷம் ஒரு 2 செகண்ட் லேட் ஆகிடுச்சுன்னா கூட உடனே ஆள் வந்துடும். உனது பீஸ் கிடக்க, நீ என்ன போய் ஜாலியாக இருக்கிறியா பண்ணுறியான்னு சொல்லிட்டு பேச ஆரம்பிச்சிருவாங்க.
Accidents are frequent in these factories. Even first aid boxes are absent. The workers face potential risk of physical ailments, UTIs, respiratory problems, and mental health issues in addition to intense violence at the workplace.
இதை சொல்லாமல் மறைக்கிறதுக்கு சமூகமும் ஒரு காரணமாக இருக்குது. ஆனால் இப்போ நாங்கள் அவங்களுக்கு கொஞ்சம் பயிற்சி கொடுக்க என்ன பண்ணுறாங்கன்னா அவங்க எங்ககிட்ட சொல்கிறாங்க. அப்பயே எங்ககிட்ட சொல்லும்போது என்ன பண்ணுவோன்னா, இது பெருசாக எடுத்துகிட்டு போயிடாதீங்க, வேலைக்கு ஏதாவது ஆபத்து வந்துடும் தான் பயப்படுவாங்க. ஆனால் அதை நாசுக்காக எப்படி ஹேண்டில் பண்ணுறதுன்னு நாங்கள் சில நேரங்களில் அதை ஹேண்டில் பண்ணி சரி பண்ணி கொடுத்துருக்கோம். அவங்களுக்கு நிறைய விஷயங்கள் அவங்களுக்கு அறியாமலே அந்த பிரச்சனையை சால்வ் பண்ண கொடுத்துருக்கோம். ஸோ இந்த மாதிரி என்னன்னா, அதனால் என்ன ஆகுதுன்னா பெண்களுக்கு எங்கள் மேலே அது ஒரு நம்பிக்கை ஏற்படுது. இவங்ககிட்ட போனால் அதாவது என்னென்னா பிரச்சனை வெளியும் தெரியக்கூடாது, ஆனால் பிரச்சனை சால்வ் ஆகணும்னு தான் நினைப்பாங்க. கம்பெனியில் கேட்டில் ஏற்றி வீட்டுக்கிட்ட கொண்டு போய் இறக்குறாங்க. அப்போ தொழிலாளிகளை நீங்கள் சந்திக்கவே முடியாது. அப்போ எங்கே சந்திக்க முடியும்னா அவங்க வீடுகளில் தான் சந்திக்க முடியும். அதனால தான் நாங்கள் வில்லேஜ் கமிட்டின்னு சொல்கிறோம். இப்போ நாங்களே எடுத்துக்கோங்களேன், இப்போ நாங்கள் வந்து ஒர்க்கிங் டேஸில் அவங்கள பார்க்கவே முடியாது. 6 மணிக்கு தான் அவங்க 7 மணிக்கு தான் வீட்டுக்கே வருவாங்க. காலையில் 6 மணிக்கு போனாங்கன்னா 7 மணிக்கு தான் வீட்டுக்கு வருவாங்க. அப்போ 7 மணிக்கு மேலே அவங்கள பார்க்கவே முடியாது. வந்தோடனே சமைக்கணும் பிடிக்கணும்னு சொல்லிட்டு வந்து அப்போ அவங்கள பார்க்கவே முடியாது. அப்போ நாங்கள் என்ன பண்ணுவோம், ஃபுல் அண்ட் ஃபுல்லாக சண்டேவை நாங்கள் எடுத்துக்குவோம். சண்டே ஃபுல்லாகவே நாங்கள் வந்து ஃபீல்டில் தான் இருப்போம். நாங்கள் இப்போ கண்காணிப்பு குழுக்கள்லாம் இருக்குது. கவர்மெண்ட்டுக்கு நிறைய சிஸ்டம் இன்றைக்கி எத்தனையோ தொழிலாளர் துறையில் பார்த்திங்கன்னா ஏசிஎல், டிசிஎல், கமிஷனர், அதேமாதிரி ஹெல்த் டிபார்ட்மெண்ட்டு, ஹெல்த் அண்ட் சேஃப்டி டிபார்ட்மெண்ட்ஸ் எல்லாமே இருக்குது. ஆனால் இவங்களுடைய ரோலை முறையாக பயன்படுத்தினாங்கன்னா நிச்சயமாக இந்த பிரச்சனை இருக்காது. அவங்கவுங்க இப்போ எப்படி இருக்காங்கன்னா கம்பெனி என்ட்ரன்ஸ் வரைக்கும் தான் அவங்களுடைய ஒர்க்காக பார்க்குறாங்க. முன்னாடியே எச்சரிக்கைப்படுத்தி ட்ரைனிங்லாம் கொடுத்து வச்சுருவாங்க. யார்ட்டையும் வந்தால் பேசக்கூடாது, இது மட்டும்தான் பேசணும், ட்ரைனிங் கொடுத்துருவாங்க. அந்த ட்ரைனிங் கொடுத்த பிறகு நான் எப்படி வாயை திறக்க முடியும்? நாங்கள் ஒரு ஆர்டிஐ ஃபைல் பண்ணுறோம். ஒரு மானிட்டரிங் கமிட்டி வந்து எத்தனை மாதத்துக்கு ஒரு தடவை நீங்கள் வந்து விசிட் பண்ணுவீங்க, போயிருக்கீங்கன்னு வேணால் ஒரு வருஷத்தில் ஒரு தடவை கூட போகலை.
Though less, the workers in the garment sector have specific income. Moreover, they have a space to sit and work. They travel together. Such spaces foster a dignified work environment for workers from marginalized Dalit communities, unlike conditions prevalent elsewhere. As educational qualifications are not considered, workers from disadvantaged Dalit communities also join these companies in large numbers. But when it comes to the issue of domestic workers' entry into households, caste discrimination is quite evident.
+2 10th இந்த மாதிரி படித்த பிள்ளைங்க வேலைக்கு அனுப்புகிறாங்க. ஏன்னா பிள்ளைங்க அதை வச்சு தான் கல்யாணமே பண்ணிட்டு போகிறாங்க. இப்போ பெண்கள் ஏன் அதிகமாக வராங்கன்னா, குடும்பத்தில் 2 அப்பா அம்மா தான் இருப்பாங்க, 2 பிள்ளைங்க இருக்கும். பிள்ளைய நல்லா படிக்க வைப்பாங்க, பொண்ணை கம்பெனிக்கு அனுப்புவாங்க. ஏன்னா பொண்ணுக்கு வந்து நகை போட்டு கல்யாணம் பண்ணி கொடுக்கணுமே. போயிட்டு ஒரு 5 வருஷம் வேலை பார்த்துச்சுன்னா அந்த செட்டில்மெண்ட்டு வாங்கி நகை எடுத்து போட்டு வண்டி எடுத்து கொடுத்து கல்யாணம் பண்ணி கொடுத்து அந்த பொண்ணு அங்கே போய் ஒரு 2 குழந்தைய பெற்றுட்டு அங்கேருந்து திரும்பவும் கம்பெனிக்கு தான் வருது. இப்போ ஆர்கே இண்டஸ்ட்ரின்னு ஒரு கார்மெண்ட்ஸ் இருக்குது இங்கே திருக்கழுக்குன்றத்தில். அங்கே வந்து நாங்கள் ஒரு 30 பேருக்கு ஏதாவது ஒரு உதவி பண்ணலாம் கொரோனாவில்னு சொல்லிட்டு லிஸ்ட் எடுக்க சொன்னேன். நான் லிஸ்ட் எடுக்க சொன்னால் அவங்க சொல்கிறாங்க 150 விதவைகள் இருக்காங்க. மொத்த கம்பெனி ஒர்க்கர்ஸே அங்கே வந்து 450 பேர் இருக்காங்க. அதில் 150 பேர் விதவை பெண்களே இருக்காங்க.
The uncertainty regarding job security in the informal sectors worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic. The laborers, especially those in the textile industry, who are in demand during the season, are considered unwanted during the off-season. During the pandemic, employees were laid off with the assurance that they would be rehired later. This was not done though. Though the free food kits for the ration card holders in both the states helped the unorganized workers to overcome hunger to an extent, liabilities of house rent, electricity, water, and loan payments all accumulated. Domestic workers were also subjected to widespread stigmatization.
கொரோனாவில் வர வேணாம்னு சொல்லிட்டாங்க மேடம்.
சம்பளம் கொடுத்தாங்களா? அப்போ
சம்பளம் 1 மாதம் கொடுத்தாங்க. அதுக்கப்புறம் அவங்க என்ன பண்ணிட்டாங்க, நீங்கள் கொரோனாவில் இத்தனை மாதம் வர முடியாது, நான் அதனால் பக்கத்தில் இருக்கிற ஆளே வச்சுக்கிறேன், எங்கள் பக்கத்து வீட்டில் இருக்கிற ஆளே வச்சுக்கிறேன்னு அவங்க சொல்லிட்டாங்க. அந்த கொரோனாவில் வந்து வீட்டு வாடகை கொடுக்காம 10 மாதத்துக்கு மேலே கொரோனா இருந்ததுயா, அதுலேயே வந்து சேர்ந்து போச்சு. 20,000 மாட்டம் வீட்டு வாடகை சேர்ந்துருக்கு. கொஞ்சம் கொஞ்சமாக தான் கொடுத்தா அவங்களுக்கு கழிச்சா இன்னமும் கொடுக்கணும். அதோட நின்றுட்டான். அதுக்கப்புறம் கொரோனா கழிச்சு இப்போ தான் மேடம் உங்கள் வேலைக்கு போனேன் ஆரம்பிக்குது. அவ்வளோ தூரத்தில் தான் வேலை கிடச்சிது, ஒரே ஒரு வீடு கிடச்சிது. அதுக்கப்புறமா இன்னொருத்தவங்க சொன்னாங்க. அதுக்கப்புறம் அதை வச்சுக்கிங்க, அதுதான் 2 பசங்க வச்சுக்கிங்க, வாடகையும் கொடுக்கணும். எதுனா ஒன்றாலும் நான் போய் தான் நான் போனோம். இப்போ கூட 2 நாளாக உடம்பு சரியில்லை, வேலைக்கு போய் தான்.
മൊബൈൽ ഉള്ളവർ കയ്യിൽ നിന്ന് അവർ വാങ്ങി അങ്ങോട്ടും ഇങ്ങോട്ടും ഒക്കെ കൂടെ അവർ പറഞ്ഞു കൊടുത്ത് അങ്ങനെ അങ്ങ് പഠിക്കുമായിരുന്നു ആ സമയത്തൊക്കെ. ഫോണില്ലായിരുന്നു ആ സമയത്തൊന്നുമില്ല, ഒരുപാട് കഷ്ടപ്പെട്ടു. പിന്നെ ലോൺ എടുത്തു, ഒരെണ്ണം വാങ്ങി. 1000 രൂപ കുറയുമ്പോഴത്തേനും നമുക്ക് അവിടെ എന്തെങ്കിലും ഒരു ബുദ്ധിമുട്ട് വരും. എന്നാൽ പോലും സാരമില്ലെന്ന് കണക്ക് ഇപ്പം ഞാനും നമുക്കിപ്പോൾ വേറെ ഒന്നും ഇല്ലെങ്കിൽ തന്നെ പ്രശ്നമില്ലല്ലോ. അപ്പം കറികളിപ്പോൾ നമുക്ക് ഒരുപാട് വേണ്ട, കഞ്ഞി കുടിച്ച് കിടന്നാൽ പോരെ. അപ്പോൾ അതുകൊണ്ട് അങ്ങനെ കിട്ടുന്ന വരുമാനത്തിൽ നിന്ന് തന്നെ അത് ക്ലോസ് ആക്കുന്നത്.
പരമ്പരാഗത മേഖലയായിരുന്നു മത്സ്യ കച്ചവടം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. പക്ഷെ ഇന്ന് ഞാൻ നേരത്തെ പറഞ്ഞതുപോലെ തൊഴിൽ നഷ്ടപ്പെട്ട സാഹചര്യത്തിൽ വണ്ടിയുള്ള യുവാക്കളിറങ്ങി, യുവതികളിറങ്ങി. ഓൺലൈൻ ഇവിടെ ഏറ്റവും കൂടുതൽ മത്സ്യ മേഖലയുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട് പറയുമ്പോൾ ഓൺലൈൻ തഴച്ചു കൊഴുത്ത് വളരുക. ഇത് സ്ത്രീകളെ ഭയങ്കരമായിട്ട് ബാധിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്. മത്സ്യത്തൊഴിലാളി സ്ത്രീകൾ ഇപ്പം പാളയം മാർക്കറ്റിൽ ചെന്ന് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ രാവിലെയൊക്കെ ചെന്നാൽ നിറച്ച് മത്സ്യ കച്ചവടക്കാരുള്ളതാണ്. ചെന്ന് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് കാണാൻ സാധിക്കും, ആരും ഉണ്ടാകില്ല. ഇനി വാങ്ങാൻ വരുന്നവരുടെ എണ്ണവും വളരെ കാര്യമായി കുറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട്. ഈ ഓൺലൈനിൽ അവരുടെ വീട്ടുമുറ്റത്ത് തന്നെ മത്സ്യം കൊണ്ട് എത്തിക്കാൻ തുടങ്ങിക്കഴിഞ്ഞപ്പോൾ പിന്നെ മത്സ്യം വാങ്ങാൻ ചന്തയിലേക്ക് വരുന്നവരുടെ എണ്ണം ഭയങ്കരമായിട്ട് കുറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട്.
ശരിക്കും നമ്മൾ കോവിഡ് കാരണം തൊഴിൽ മേഖലയിൽ എന്തുമാത്രം തൊഴിൽ നഷ്ടം ഉണ്ടായിട്ടുണ്ടെന്നുള്ളതിനെപ്പറ്റി കൃത്യമായ ഒരു പഠനം കേരളത്തിൽ നടന്നിട്ടില്ല. അത് നോക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു സ്ത്രീകൾക്കും ട്രാൻസ്ജെൻഡേഴ്സിനും ആയിരിക്കും ഏറ്റവും കൂടുതൽ തൊഴിൽ നഷ്ടം ഉണ്ടായിട്ടുള്ളത്. അതിൽ പുരുഷന്മാർക്ക് എപ്പോഴും തൊഴിൽ നഷ്ടപ്പെട്ട് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ വീണ്ടും അത് സമൂഹത്തിൽ ഇറങ്ങിയ ആളുകളുമായിട്ട് ഇടപെട്ട് പുതിയൊരു തൊഴിൽ കണ്ടെത്തുക എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് അത്ര ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുള്ള കാര്യമല്ല. സ്ത്രീകൾക്ക് അങ്ങനെയല്ല. പിന്നെ ഉള്ള ഒരു തൊഴിൽ നഷ്ടപ്പെട്ട് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ വീണ്ടും ഒരു തൊഴിൽ നേടുന്നതിന് ഫാമിലിയിൽ നിന്നൊരു റെസ്ട്രിക്ഷനൊക്കെ ഉണ്ടാവും. അപ്പോൾ ഇങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ ഉള്ള കേസുകളിൽ അവരുടെ ഒരു പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് ഈ ഒരു കോവിഡ് സാഹചര്യത്തിൽ അവരുടെ ഒരു റീഎംപ്ലോയ്മെൻറ്റും സ്കില്ലിങ്ങും വളരെ പ്രധാനമാണെന്ന് തോന്നുന്നു.
The delay in restoring public transportation, even after lockdown restrictions were lifted, adversely affected women in the informal sector. On-demand services have been one of the bright spots during the pandemic. Though the presence of women in the app-based services was very limited before, there was a boost in numbers during the pandemic as other conventional jobs came to a standstill. It was the socio-cultural shifts and mechanization in the 1980s that brought out huge changes in the traditional jobs. By the 90s, since liberalization, cheapening of labor occurred and the informal labor market mostly involved women. As a society still tends to restrict the socio-political activities of women, the mainstream trade unions always had lesser women participation. Building leadership among the women who considered themselves at the bottom of the hierarchy was a challenge for most of the women's organizations.
നമ്മൾ ഈ തൊഴിലാളികളെ സംഘടിപ്പിക്കുമ്പോൾ അവർ പറയുന്ന നിങ്ങൾ എന്തെങ്കിലും തൊഴിൽ ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ടോ എന്ന് ചോദിക്കുമ്പോൾ ആദ്യം ഇവർ പറയില്ല. പിന്നെ പറയും ഞങ്ങൾ കുട ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ട്, സ്റ്റാർ നിർമ്മിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്, വീട്ടിൽ നിന്ന് ടീ സ്നാക്സ് ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്നുണ്ട്, പിന്നെ മെഴുതിരി ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്നുണ്ട്, ചന്ദനത്തിരി ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്നുണ്ട്, പൂക്കൾ ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്നുണ്ട്, വള ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്നുണ്ട്, മാല ഉണ്ടാക്കും. അപ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ ചോദിക്കും നിങ്ങളിതൊരു തൊഴിലായിട്ട് കാണുന്നില്ലേ? ഇല്ല ചേച്ചി, ഞങ്ങളുടെ വീട്ടിലെ എല്ലാ ജോലിയൊക്കെ കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് വെറുതെ സമയം കളയാൻ വേണ്ടി ചെയ്യുന്ന. പക്ഷേ ഈ മേഖലയെ ഇവിടുത്തെ കമ്പനികളൊക്കെ തന്നെ, ഇപ്പം സ്റ്റാർ ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്ന കമ്പനികളാകട്ടെ, കൊടയുണ്ടാക്കുന്ന കമ്പനികളാകട്ടെ, ഇവരൊക്കെ തന്നെ ഈ തൊഴിലാളികളുടെ തൊഴിലിനെ ചൂഷണം ചെയ്യുക, അവരുടെ ലേബറിനെ ചൂഷണം ചെയ്യുക. ഇവർക്ക് സ്വയബോധം ഇല്ലാത്തത് കൊണ്ട് തന്നെ ഒരു ബാർഗൈനിങ് നടക്കുന്നില്ല.
The 4 newly formed labor codes of the central government, which are replacing the existing 44 laws, are massively condemned by the trade unions, affirming it will adversely affect the workers. The labor codes were formulated with no proper consultation with trade unions, violating the International Labour Organization's Convention 144. R. Geeta, the advisor to the Unorganized Workers Federation, appealed to the Tamil Nadu government to protect the existing state labour laws and state welfare boards. Pennurumai Iyakkam, led by Geeta, is working with a special focus on gender equality for women workers and their economic rights. There is an ongoing attempt to register unorganized workers, including migrants, and gig and platform workers on the union government's latest e-Shram portal. The registration drive is expected to benefit a large number of casual labourers in the unorganized sector, who are yet to claim various benefits under the union and state government's social security schemes.
ഞങ്ങളെ യൂണിയനൊക്കെ നിലനിൽക്കുന്നിടത്തോളം കാലം ഞങ്ങൾ അത് തന്നെ പറഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ട് പോകും. തുല്യ ജോലിക്ക് തുല്യവേതനം, തൊഴിലാളികളെ മനുഷ്യനായി പരിഗണിക്കണം, തൊഴിലാളികളെ തൊഴിലാളിയെ അംഗീകരിക്കണം, എഴുതി വെച്ച പുസ്തകത്തിലെ എല്ലാ നിയമങ്ങളും തൊഴിലാളികൾക്ക് അനുഭവിക്കാൻ ലേബർ ഓഫീസർമാർ തയ്യാറാവണം. അതിന് ലേബർ ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റ്, ലേബർ തൊഴിൽ മന്ത്രിമാരൊക്കെ അത് നടപ്പിലാക്കാനുള്ള എന്തെല്ലാം തരത്തിൽ ഇടപെടാൻ പറ്റുമോ അത് ഇടപെടണം എന്നൊക്കെ തന്നെയാണ് ഞങ്ങൾക്ക് പറയാനുള്ളത്. അത് തമിഴ്നാട്ടിലും കേരളത്തിലും മാത്രം പോരാ, ലോകത്തുടനീളം അത് വരണം എന്നാണ് ഞങ്ങൾ പറയുന്നത്. അവരും ജനിക്കുന്നു, മരിക്കുന്നു, ഇതൊക്കെ അനുഭവിച്ചും കൊണ്ടല്ലേ മരിച്ചുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്നത്. കുറച്ച് സന്തോഷം, സമാധാനം ഞങ്ങൾക്കും വേണം. എന്നിട്ട് ഞങ്ങൾ മരിച്ചോട്ടെ.